Huck Finn is a boy about 13 or 14 years old. He's the son of the town drunk, and he's lived most of his life without a mother and homeless. He's used to wearing ragged, cast-off clothes, never going to school, and doing pretty much whatever he wants. He's very good at outdoor things like hunting, fishing, and trapping. At the beginning of the book, he's living in a house because he's been adopted by the widow Douglas, who's trying to civilize him. Huck and the widow live with the widow's sister, Miss Watson, who scolds Huck frequently. The widow and Miss Watson also own a number of slaves. Whenever he can, Huck sneaks off with his friend, Tom Sawyer, and they pretend to be in a robber's gang. One night, Huck climbs into his bedroom window after being out with Tom, and he finds his vagrant father, Pap, waiting for him in his bedroom. Pap tells Huck to stop acting like he's better than his father, meaning stop going to school and reading. He makes Huck give him money so he can get drunk. After a while, Pap kidnaps Huck and takes him to live with him in a cabin in the woods by the river. Huck is happier in some ways, being out of school, but Pap gets drunk a lot and beats Huck, and even tries to kill him when he gets so drunk he's hallucinating. One night, when Pap is out, Huck fakes his own murder and escapes to Jackson's Island. After a few days on the island, he stumbles onto the remains of a campfire and realizes someone else is on the island too. The other person turns out to be Jim, a slave owned by Miss Watson, and part of the household where Huck lived with the widow. Jim says he's run away because he heard Miss Watson talking about selling him down the river for $800. If that happened, he would be taken from his family and brought down to New Orleans to be sold as a field worker in the Deep South. Huck promises right off not to tell anyone that Jim ran away, but he knows that keeping this secret is a big deal. Jim is going to be hunted, and any white person who sees him might stop him and try to take him into custody. Huck also knows that other white people would despise him for helping a runaway slave, but he doesn't care about this too much because he spent his whole life not following the rules and being looked down on by most of his town. He describes himself as sort of low down and ornery, so breaking a rule doesn't bother him. Huck and Jim strike up a friendship pretty quickly. They mostly talk about superstitions and signs, such as things that say whether you're going to have bad luck or get rich. They find a cave high up on the island to camp in, and soon there's a big storm that makes the river rise and cover most of the island. They catch a raft floating by. A while later, a house that's been carried off in the flood floats by. They go in and find some clothes and money and other items, and they see a dead man inside the house. Huck goes to the shore to see if he can hear any news. He dresses in girl's clothes that he found in the house, and he speaks to a woman in a cabin. The woman figures out that he's a boy, not a girl, but she doesn't get mad about it. She tells him that her husband thinks the runaway slave is hiding on the island and is going there with some other men that night to try to catch him. So Huck hurries back to get Jim, and they start floating down the Mississippi River on the raft. Huck and Jim have a number of adventures on the raft, traveling at night so no one stops them. They see an abandoned steamboat that's been wrecked in the middle of the river. They sneak onto it, and then they realize 3 thieves and murderers are on it, and they have to steal the gang's boat to get away. Huck and Jim get separated in a heavy fog, with Huck in the canoe and Jim on the raft. It takes a long time for Huck to find Jim again, and Jim is overwhelmed with joy when Huck's back. Huck plays a trick on him by pretending Jim dreamed about the whole fog, and they were never separated. When Jim realizes he's lying, his feelings are hurt, and Huck feels bad and apologizes. That's an important moment, because Huck becomes aware that Jim actually cares about him, and he cares about Jim, which he hadn't really thought about before. Huck and Jim are hoping to come to the town of Cairo, because that town is where the Ohio River empties into the Mississippi. If they get off there, Jim can buy passage on a steamboat going up the Ohio River, and he'll be on the way to freedom. When they think they're getting close to Cairo, Huck's conscience starts to bother him, because now he's not just hanging out with Jim, he's close to actually setting him free, which his society has taught him is wrong. It's basically like stealing Miss Watson's property from her, just to spite her. But it turns out they passed Cairo in the fog, and they can't travel back upstream because they're in a raft. A steamboat coming up the river runs over their raft, and they have to dive down below its wheel to avoid being killed, so they get separated. Huck comes ashore all wet, and goes to the first house he sees. He winds up getting taken in and adopted by a family called the Grangerfords. He stays with them for a number of days, becoming friends with a boy his own age named Buck. The Grangerfords have been in a feud for 30 years with another large wealthy family called the Shepherdsons. The feud comes to a head when Buck's sister, Sophia Grangerford, runs off and elopes with one of the Shepherdsons. A gun battle takes place in which Buck and other family members are killed, and Huck runs away. Huck reunites with Jim, who's been hiding in the woods with the Grangerford slaves bringing him food. They keep going down the river, and the next thing that happens is that they rescue a pair of con men who are being chased by a crowd of people they've swindled. Huck and Jim take them onto the raft and carry them away. The problem is that once the con men are on the raft with them, they don't want to leave, and there's nothing Huck and Jim can do about it. The two men call themselves the Duke and the King. One claims that he's really the Duke of Bridgewater, and the other claims that he's the son of Louis XVI and should be the King of France. The Duke and the King plan all sorts of scams on the raft. They practice Shakespearean acting and sword fighting, and plan to impersonate famous actors from London on tour at the next town they come to. They come to a little Arkansas town where they see a man named Colonel Sherburne shoot a harmless drunk who's insulting him. A lynch mob comes to hang Colonel Sherburne, but he stands them down, telling them they're not man enough to lynch him. The Duke and the King's Shakespeare performance is a total flop, so they change their approach and advertise a show called the Royal Nonsuch. They get customers to buy tickets by saying, "Ladies and children not admitted." All that happens in the show is that the king comes out on stage on all fours, naked and painted different colors. The show only lasts a minute or two. The audience knows they've been swindled, but decides to keep quiet about it and tell the other locals to see it too. After 2 nights of this, the Duke and the King run off, just as the town is about to pelt them with rotten tomatoes and dead cats. The Duke and King pull off some other scams, but their biggest one is when they arrive in a town where a man named Peter Wilkes has just died, and they pretend to be his long-lost brothers and heirs. They get the man's daughters to welcome them into the home, and they start selling the slaves and liquidating the estate. Huck steals the money from the Duke and the King and tells one of the daughters that they're con men. The real brothers of the dead man arrive, and the Duke and King barely manage to escape back to the raft. The final scam of the Duke and King is to claim that Jim is a runaway slave and sell him to a farmer named Phelps who can claim a reward for returning him. That's the last Huck has to deal with the con men. Soon after, they try the Royal Nonsuch performance and get tarred and feathered. Huck goes to the Phelps house to look for Jim, and the Phelps family turn out to be Tom Sawyer's aunt and uncle. Huck pretends that he's Tom Sawyer, arrived for a visit with the family, and Tom Sawyer himself shows up and pretends to be his own younger brother, Sid. Jim is being kept prisoner in a shed, and Huck wants to set him free, which will be extremely easy to do. Tom insists that they don't. He thinks that Jim's escape should be like other famous prison escapes he's read about in history and in novels involving kings and noblemen. He wants to dig a tunnel into the shed rather than open a door. He wants Jim to write notes and carve inscriptions in stone to throw out of the prison, and to water a plant with his tears, and to make friends with spiders and snakes, and he makes Jim and Huck participate in all of this. Finally, they set him free, but they've sent anonymous letters warning the Phelps of danger. So when they escape with them, farmers shoot at them and hit Tom in the leg. They escape to the raft, but Huck has to get a doctor to help Tom, and the doctor turns in Jim and Tom. Tom's Aunt Polly arrives and exposes the truth about who Huck and Tom are. Tom reveals that Jim was free all along. Miss Watson had died and set him free in her will. Tom was just interested in the adventure. Jim tells Huck that his father, Pap, is dead too. He was the dead man on the floating house. Tom's Aunt Sally says she wants to adopt Huck and civilize him, but Huck's had enough of this, and he decides to travel to the west.